Hello, I'm Chris Burns, and welcome to The Network, where we connect into a matrix of newsmakers to get to the heart of an issue. Watch out, they've got to answer in 25 seconds or less, or else. Let's take a look at that issue right now.
The discontent has different names: Blockupy, Indignados, Arab Spring, Brazilian Summer. The common thread, a crisis of confidence in which voters are fed up with political systems that have so far failed to deliver in a 5-year-old financial and economic crisis. Unemployment has topped 12% in Europe, double that among youth. And with European Parliament elections a year away, the time is right for a throw the rascals out approach by voters. What could be more catastrophic would be voters shunning the ballot box. Turnout in European Parliament elections has steadily declined in recent years to about 40%, and a much lower figure next year could throw the Parliament into an existential crisis. How to address that discontent and disenfranchisement that is driving so many to resort to internet-driven movements? Flash mob rebellions that have shaken both democracies and autocracies to their foundations.
Now, wired into this edition of The Network is here at the European Parliament in Brussels, Saul Trumbo, project coordinator of the EU Economic Governance Project at the Transnational Institute, or TNI. That's a worldwide fellowship of activist scholars. Saul, by the way, has been involved in the Indignado and Occupy movements. In Rijeka, Croatia, Robert Manchin, managing director of Gallup Organization Europe. A recent Gallup survey worldwide indicates 57% of adults think it's a bad time to look for a job. The figure is 75% in Europe. Talk about confidence there. And in Paris, Pierre Vinicki, general director of Institut Confiance, a think tank that works to restore confidence between policymakers, stakeholders, the media, and the public. Here a question to all of you, starting with Saul. Why now? Why are governments worse than ever now, or are social networks more powerful and holding governments more accountable? Saul.
Well, I think that we are facing a systemic crisis. There is a disbelief in the political structures that are in place because they don't represent the real needs of the population. And we can see in the way that the political parties, especially in Europe, are managing the crisis. They haven't managed the crisis, have used the crisis to implement an austerity agenda.
Okay, Saul is saying it's the governments really that are worse than ever. Robert, what do you see in terms of your surveys?
What I see is a longer term than just the last 5 years. There's a general erosion of trust, and in general, and in institutions.
Then, Pierre, is it that it sounds like we're saying here that governments are out of touch? Is that right?
What we see now is the result of a long-term distrust culture that has evolved along the years, and that is a long-term problem that has to be addressed today, not just a short-term issue.
Okay, now let me just look at one angle of this, and unemployment being a big factor in this lack of confidence. Could this be because of jobless recovery? Not a lot of jobs are being created by this recovery from the crisis, and businesses are forced to seek short-term profits. Could that be the root of the cause, Saul?
Well, definitely the lack of jobs puts a population in a very desperate situation. The problem is that the European institutions have had a very specific role of imposing austerity in the European economies, with the result of even further destruction of jobs, of destruction of the welfare state.
Okay. Robert, how do you see that?
I would say that people can survive all kinds of crises. The problem is if they don't see the future, whether anybody has a clue how it will be better. And I see, at least in Europe, that's a main point, that people are losing hope that in 5 years from now it would be better.
All right. Pierre, do you think that is it governments, is it business? Who's at fault here? Who's falling down on the job?
No one and everyone at the same time. But I would say that how would you expect to create a climate of trust and hope in European countries and among European citizens when inside institutions themselves there is no culture of trust at all, or too limited, as a matter of fact.
But this culture of trust is a little bit difficult for me to figure out. Let me pitch it over to Saul. Is this a matter of governments not communicating enough?
It's not about a lack of communication because politicians control all the corporate media. I think it's a problem of lack of democracy and accountability, not only at the national level but at the European level. We have to remember that the European Commission and the European Central Bank, which are very important institutions to impose austerity, don't have any kind of accountability.
You were part of the Occupy movement, 3,000 people who surrounded the ECB, who blocked the ECB, by the way. Robert, do you think that it's a matter of communication, or is it a matter of something else? How do you restore this trust, this confidence?
You cannot really do it with communication itself. People are not dumb. They experience, and the experiences are accumulating. Same thing like with a kid. First you trust, and when you fail to deliver, then people still trust or like to trust, but less and less. And the problem is with trust that it's much harder to rebuild than to lose it.
Okay, but Saul, you sort of are part of a movement that doesn't really want to cooperate. They want to fight what is going on. How do you see the European Parliament elections coming up next year? Do you see that as a test of government, of how that can work?
Well, it depends, because the social movements are very broad. It's true that there are some groups that are really about giving more power to the European Parliament, so the power of the European Union would rely more in the European Parliament than in the other institutions.
Is that what you'd like to see?
Well, I think this is not enough, definitely. For instance, we have to remember the root causes of the crisis was a completely unregulated finance sector, and then the bailout of the finance sector by all the governments. This has not been addressed. The only solution presented by the politicians is about privatizing public sector and dismantling the welfare state.
Robert, then, is it a matter of empowering certain institutions even more, like the Parliament? Because that's an elected institution.
Well, I think we are talking about two different things. On the one hand, we want to create a European public. We would like to see Europe as a unified space where people are represented, and that representation can happen directly at the European Parliament level. At the same time, institutionally, the way the whole European Union is set up is that there is a divided trust between European institutions and national institutions. And the national institutions, of course, go back and forth to keep as much trust for themselves as possible. And Europe is very divided on this one. That in some countries you have much higher trust in local national governments. In some others you have much more trust in the European institutions.
Okay,
so the balance is changing.
Okay, I've got to shift over. Pierre, last word. How are we going to create that trust, for instance, with the elections, the Parliament elections next year? Very quickly.
I believe we have to make people feel that there is going to be consistency between words and deeds. That's very important, and people do not feel that yet. For example, when Europe and everyone says we need more entrepreneurship, competitiveness, and so forth, there has to be acts that demonstrate that. And if the culture is a culture not of trust, that doesn't help.
Words and actions, that's what we got to see, according to all of you there. Thanks very much for joining us on the program. I'd like to thank all of our guests, Saul Trumbo, Robert Manchin, and Pierre Winnicki. I'm Chris Burns, and until next time, thanks for connecting with The Network.